Hi, everyone. This is Daniel Karapkin speaking to you from Thornhill, Ontario for webyeshiva.org. We are studying Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, the Rambam's Moreh Nevukhim. We are in section 3, and we're going to be starting chapter 41 today. Just a reminder again that there is a new edition of the guide that in English that has just been published. I do recommend it, although I still feel very, very comfortable with the Shlomo Pines edition that we are using that was published in the early 1960s. I guess, once you get used to something, it's hard to make a transition. But the new edition, published by Professor Len Goodman, has a lot of very relevant footnotes in it. And those of you who can procure it, I do recommend it. So I'm going to be sharing our screen today. We have a lot of material to cover. Chapter 41 is one of those long chapters, and it's got a lot of material in it. We had started our discussion, and by the way, as I always mention, if anyone wants to download this, what I find to be a very helpful outline of our chapter, I recommend that you go to either our Facebook group, Shiur in Moreh Nevukhim, to download the outline, or you can go to webyeshiva.org, and in the course description of today's shiur, they have the document for download. As we've mentioned, chapters 40 to 42 deal with 3 categories of mitzvot out of the Rambam's 14 categories that he outlined in chapter 35, which deal primarily with institutions that protect society and man's interaction with his fellow man. That is the mitzvot that we call ben adam lechavero. Now, here in chapter 41, we're going to deal with the aspect of penalties and punishments designed by the Torah. And so we're going to be covering a lot of mitzvot. And instead of explaining the reasons for the individual mitzvot, the Rambam is only going to be focusing on the commandment to punish the sinner for those things which he does, which are hazardous or harmful to his fellow human being or to society at large. And these were all given, and this is going to be the undercurrent of the thesis of the entire chapter. When God describes the punishment that is due to a perpetrator of a sin, the purpose of describing that punishment and prescribing that punishment, that it should be administered by a court of law, is in order to deter a person from committing that sin. And furthermore, if a person does commit that sin and they see the punishment that an individual gets for that sin, it deters others from doing that crime. And the benefit to society, therefore, is self-apparent, that when people are sufficiently disincentivized from committing harmful crimes, then the society at large is protected. In the course of this chapter, however, even though the Rambam says that this chapter deals with mitzvot that are ben adam lechavero, between man and his fellow man, that's vis-a-vis the punishments that man is subject to receive from his fellow man in Beit Din, in a court of law. The Rambam will also discuss penalties for all mitzvot, including those which are ben adam lamakom, between man and God, such as Sabbath observance and the prohibition of idolatry. So the reason why it's included in a chapter that deals with ben adam lechavero is because there is a ben adam lechavero aspect, a social aspect, in that it is the responsibility of society to deal with that perpetrator appropriately. So let's get started, because we're going to have to divide this chapter into at least 2 parts. I'm hopeful that we'll be able to cover it in 2 shiurim. We'll do the first half today, but still a lot of material. So we've already mentioned the benefit of the Torah's enumeration of the sundry punishments for the violation of the Torah. And most of the laws that are going to be contained in this chapter can be found in Sefer Shoftim of the Mishnah Torah. That is the volume of the 14 volumes of the Rambam's Mishnah Torah that deals with the function of the Sanhedrin, of the Beit Din, the Jewish courts. It talks about the punishments that man is subject to receive for the violation of various mitzvot. And as the Rambam wrote in chapter 35, in discussing this part, this is the 6th class of commandments. Their benefit is apparent. For if sinners and robbers were not punished, injury would not be prevented at all, and persons scheming evil would not become rarer. They are wrong, those who suppose that it would be an act of mercy to abandon the laws of compensation for injuries. On the contrary, it would be perfect cruelty and injury to the social state of the country. It is an act of mercy that God commanded judges and officers, thou shalt appoint for yourself in all of your gates. I'm using mostly the Friedlander translation in this one. But the point is that the Rambam made a very, very strong argument that you need a strong police presence, you need a strong court system, you need a very strongly adhered to system of laws that where the perpetrator is properly punished in order for society to be protected. That is what we would call, you have to be cruel in order to be kind. You have to know that people who are perpetrators of crime are going to be taken care of in order for the welfare of the general society to be preserved. And therefore, the Rambam comes to this general rule. The punishment given to anyone who has wronged someone else consists in his being given exactly the same treatment that he has given to the other. And this is meant to disincentivize someone and to make sure that he is careful prophylactically to make sure that he doesn't do anything that is going to harm another person because he stands to receive the same punishment himself. So, for example, the Rambam says, if he injured someone bodily, his body is injured. That's the idea of an eye for an eye, which we're going to discuss today. If he injured someone's property, his property is injured. In other words, what deserves to happen to him is if he burns down someone's field, his field should be burned down, or at least he has to feel the pain of losing the same amount of money that he caused the loss to his friend. So therefore, he would have to take money out of his bank, the value of which is the damage that he caused, in order to make sure that he is careful in the future to avoid damaging other people's property. Now, I want to make a very important point here, and that is the Rambam clearly understands that the reason why the Torah prescribes any punishment, even restitution, to an injured party is not to make the injured party whole, but it is rather for the person who is the offending party to make sure that he feels the pain that the other person felt as a way of making sure that it won't happen in the future. Okay, and this is a very important distinction because normally we think that there's a difference between punishing someone for a religious violation, such as a person who eats non-kosher food. He needs to be punished. He needs to feel pain in order to be disincentivized from not repeating the offense of eating the non-kosher food. But if I break someone's window, I have to compensate them in order to make them whole so that they can replace their window pane. However, the Rambam sees no distinction between those two. His opinion is that all penalties and punishments are of the same genre to make sure that the offense does not recur. Now, in most cases, the Rambam says, the injured party has a right to forgive the offender, but not in cases of murder. And you're going to see how the Rambam makes this argument in the course of his overall thesis that penalties are there to disincentivize the person. That is, even if the murder victim takes a while to die, and while on his deathbed he says, I forgive the murderer, we must nonetheless execute the murderer. And the Torah thus says, and this is the biblical command, V'la'aretz lo yichupar l'dam asher shupach ba ki im b'dam shovcho. As the Torah says in the book of Numbers, the land will not be atoned for the blood that has spilled in it unless we take the blood of the murderer. And this is, for the Rambam, no different from making restitution to someone who has had a broken window. It's all of the same genre. The only difference is that the person whose window got broken can say, Ich bin moichel, I forgive you. You don't have to pay me back. I'll take care of it myself. Now, if the question then, of course, becomes, if the whole objective of a penalty is in order to make a person who injured or caused damage to make sure that he doesn't do it again, and to make sure that other people in society learn from that, Why then is it okay for an injured party to be moichel, to forgive the damage? And so the Rambam doesn't express this explicitly, but the point is that that is the special exception. There's a special exception that since it wasn't considered to be heavy damage, it's not a major crime, it was done unintentionally. Therefore, God will sometimes go easy on the perpetrator, and as long as the injured party is willing to forgive, the offending party will be off the hook. But that does not negate the fact that there are certain crimes for which God says you will never be off the hook, because if we allow you to be off the hook in that case, then society will begin to disintegrate and chaos will ensue. There must always be a soul for a soul, therefore, regardless of the respective stations of the perpetrator and victim. And as you'll notice, the Rambam makes a point of saying this is because it's not tit for tat. The idea of an eye for an eye is not, in the opinion of the Rambam, to make sure that there's an exact equal exchange. Because I can never, by taking out my eye, if I knock out your eye, I can never make you whole through the taking out of my eye. And similarly, when a person commits murder, he is executed not because his life is exactly equivalent to another person's life. One person may be less than, one person may be more than another person in their value or contribution to society. But the fact is that God says, if we're going to be able to prevent future violent crime, we have to take a very hard stance on people who murder. And that's the reason why Hashem says, I cannot allow this to be overlooked. This is because the Rambam says among the crimes of man, there is no greater crime than murder. Now, when someone destroys another limb, the perpetrator's limb, therefore, must be destroyed. That's what is known in Latin as lex talionis. That is common in many ancient legal systems. Ka'asher yitain mum ba'adam ken yinatein bo, as it says in Leviticus, whatever injury one afflicts upon his friend, such injury will be afflicted to him. And the Rambam then makes a very interesting point. He says, do not get bogged down by the fact that the real punishment, as explained by the sages, is monetary compensation. Instead, when a person knocks out his friend's eye, we do not take out his eye, but rather we force him to make monetary compensation. My purpose here is to give reasons for biblical commandments and not for the Talmudic interpretation. Now, that's an exact quote from the Rambam. The Rambam states in this chapter, I'm here to give, my purpose is to give reasons for the biblical texts and not for the pronouncements of the Talmudic or Torah Sheba'al Peh interpretation. Now, many commentaries grapple with this statement, which appears at face value to be inconsistent with other portions of the guide, where the Rambam has no problem explaining Torah Sheba'al Peh, rabbinic interpretation of biblical text. However, the Rambam seems to be saying that the biblical text provides the true reason for criminal punishment, to disincentivize the criminal by informing him that whatever he does to another person will be done to him in turn. That's what I really believe is what the Rambam is trying to communicate here. The rabbis break down the biblical punishment into what is fair and commensurate within society. But the Torah saying an eye for an eye does so for a reason, even though the author of the Torah, Hashem, knew very well that it doesn't mean to be taken literally. It's because God wants man to read that and to understand that he must go out of his way to avoid at all costs harming other people, because whatever harm he causes to others, he deserves to have that harm inflicted upon him. And therefore, the Talmud offers multiple explanations why destroying another person's eye or limb is impractical if he's the offending party. One reason is because, as the commentaries on the guide say, and this is stated by the Gemara explicitly, it's impossible to damage the perpetrator in exactly the same way that he damaged another, since his limb or eye may be stronger or weaker than his victim's. As such, the only fair alternative is monetary payment. The key, however, is that the requirement to pay is not to make the victim whole, as I mentioned, but rather to deprive the perpetrator in a way that is proximate to how he deprived another. This appears to be the reason why the Rambam stated above that there is no forgiveness for the murderer, noting that the punishment is not to help the victim, but rather to punish the perpetrator. It is not within the purview of the victim to release the perpetrator from punishment unless the Torah makes an allowance for a relatively minor form of injury. And then the Rambam says another sort of surprising statement. He says, nonetheless, I do have my reasons for why the Talmud interprets the verse as such, that we don't take an eye for an eye, but rather require monetary restitution, but I will only relate it verbally. Now, why the Rambam felt he could not relate this textually and only wanted to relate it verbally to his student privately is a bit of a mystery. But I think that really it speaks to just overall, this is not necessary. There may be a lot more depth to this, but just on the surface value, what the Rambam feels is that if I were to go into a lengthy discussion as to why the Talmud says you make monetary restitution instead of literally an eye for an eye, I would be detracting from the theme of this chapter, which is to explain to you that the overarching theme of why the Torah administers punishments is so that the reader will be duly disincentivized from committing the offense, knowing that whatever he does to others will be done to him. And that's the bottom line. So we're going to have to go on because of constraints of time, but this discussion in itself is a very worthwhile thing to expand upon. And therefore, only in cases where an exact punishment in kind to the perpetrator cannot be performed is monetary restitution mandated. So, for example, there are additional compensatory damages that the court assesses upon a person because we can't necessarily replicate the same thing in the perpetrator. So, for example, the time off that a person has to take off from work because he's been injured. Let's say, I caused someone physical damage, and as a result, they have to take off 2 weeks off of work to recuperate from their broken leg or whatever it is. So I have to pay for their time lost from work. I also have to pay for their medical expenses. These are not things that can be replicated within the perpetrator, and therefore the court makes him pay for those things. Next, property damage and theft. The penalty is the same for both. Whatever damage he caused in kind must be extracted from him. And once you understand that the Rambam applies this principle to all penalties and punishments in the Torah, you see that there's really no difference whether a person damages or breaks a person's window or goes into their house with stealth and steals their valuables. In both cases, whatever a person did to make another person deficient, that same thing is taken from him. So if I broke your window and it costs $100 to fix, they take $100 from me. And that's all the perpetrator needs to know. It's not that it's not as important that the perpetrator knows that the damaged party is getting his $100. He just needs to feel the pain of lacking $100 himself. In the same vein, when a person steals with stealth, he's a thief, and he breaks into someone's home and he steals their property, what does the Torah say he has to do? He has to make restitution of what he stole, but that's not enough because then he's not feeling the pain of being out of stolen goods. You have to take away from him the exact value of what he stole in addition to returning what he stole. So if he stole a string of pearls that's worth $1,000, he has to give back the string of pearls, and then we force him to pay $1,000 on top of that. That's what the Gemara calls tashlume kefel. It's paying double. But in reality, from the perspective of the Rambam, it's actually not paying double. It's actually making the perpetrator feel the pain of having something taken from him of the same value that he sought to take from another person. And then the Rambam writes something which is a foreshadow to a general rule that he will give us shortly. The more prevalent the crime and the easier it is to commit, the more the Torah must come down hard on the perpetrator to sufficiently disincentivize him from committing that crime. If a crime is prevalent and it's easy to commit, the Torah then has to create a stronger disincentive to distance people who would be tempted otherwise to commit the crime. And that is why, in the context of theft, the penalty for stealing a sheep to pay is fourfold. Now, many of you may be familiar with the Rashi who quotes the words of Chazal, of our sages, who say that when the Torah states that if you steal a sheep, it's not enough just to pay kefil, it's not just enough to pay the value of what you stole after returning the sheep. You have to pay 4 times. So that is, you have to return the sheep plus pay 3 times the value of the sheep in addition to that. Now, what is the reason for that? So Rashi says, quoting our sages, that this is it's because people value their livestock more. But the Rambam says that sheep are out in the field and therefore are easier to steal. It's easier to steal a sheep than it is to break into someone's home to steal their string of pearls. And for that reason, the Torah has to come up with a stronger disincentive to prevent you from stealing sheep because they're so accessible to thieves. Thieves typically get rid of the livestock they steal as quickly as possible so as not to get caught red-handed, which is why the Torah imposes the 4-time penalty, pay 4 times what you stole, only in cases where the animal is sold or butchered, because that's typically what thieves will do. And stealing cattle carries an even higher penalty of paying 5 times the value. So Rashi there says the reason why stealing a sheep only has to pay 4 is because we have rachmanus, we have compassion on the thief, because he had to lift up the sheep when stealing it, and the burden of carrying will knock for that burden will knock off one payment. So therefore, when you steal a cow or an ox, you can't pick it up. You have to lead it. It's not as much of a burden. You have to pay 5 times. And when you steal a sheep, you have to pay 4 times. But the Rambam disagrees, and he says the surface meaning of why you pay even more when stealing an ox, consistent with the theme of this chapter, is because it is even easier to steal an ox than a sheep, since sheep graze together and are therefore more guarded by the shepherd, whereas oxen or cows or cattle graze by themselves. If you ever look at drive by a field where cows are grazing, you notice there's no shepherd per se that's looking over them. They're not hanging around all together. They're pretty disparate and scattered, and therefore it's even easier to steal an ox than it is to steal a sheep, and therefore the penalty must be stiffer. Another example of a tit-for-tat punishment is that against false witnesses. We're now in our outline on number 6. As it says in Deuteronomy, if a person seeks to incriminate another falsely by bearing false testimony, va'asitem lo kasher zamam la'asot le'achiv, you do to the false witness that which he sought to do to his brother. If they wanted him to be killed, then they are put to death. If they wanted him to be flogged, to get malkut, then they are flogged, etc. The objective is to make the penalty fit the crime, which is why the Torah calls its judgments chukim umishpatim tzadikim, righteous and fair law. And that's, again, the theme is tit for tat. Whatever a person does to another to make them feel deficient, that same feeling of deficiency is inflicted upon the perpetrator. So then the obvious question is, if one of these things is not like another. If a person is a gazlan, if a person is a robber, he doesn't have to pay any penalties. All he has to do is return the thing that he robbed. Now, what's the difference between a robber and a thief? A thief is a person who steals with stealth, and a robber is a person who just goes over to a woman on the street, mugs her, grabs her purse, and runs away. The question is, in that situation, according to Jewish law, once we catch the mugger, we take the purse, we give it back to the lady, and there's no other financial restitution that mugger has to face. He just simply makes restitution and he goes scot-free. Obviously, it is within the jurisprudence of the judge if this is a repeat offender, if this is an unpenitent offender. Sometimes the Beit Din will have the discretion to be able to punish him further. But the standard punishment for a gazlan is just to give back what he stole. Why don't we penalize him in the same way that we penalize the thief who steals with stealth? So the answer is because robbery is a rarity, according to the Rambam. Theft can occur anywhere, whereas robbery only occurs with difficulty. People can further safeguard themselves more easily against robbers. Furthermore, usually you know the identity of the robber, and so you can track him down. The Torah therefore doesn't see a need to disincentivize the robber as much as the thief. This is the Rambam's theory, that there aren't going to be a lot of violent crimes of robbery because people know that they're in all likelihood going to get caught, and it's a very unlikely occurrence within a Jewish society for people to be robbers. And therefore, we don't need to clamp down hard and create very strong disincentives for this crime because it's unlikely that it's going to be committed in the first place. All of the above, everything that we've said up until now, that the penalty and the punishment that is placed upon a perpetrator by the Torah is in order to disincentivize him, leads the Rambam to a general introduction, which he had really foreshadowed a few lines ago. And this is number 8. The introduction is the magnitude and difficulty of a penalty depends upon 4 considerations. First of all, the severity of the crime. If great harm is caused, the penalty is greater. Number 2, the prevalence of the crime. How common of a crime is this to occur within society? The more prevalent, the more common it is, the more it needs to be disincentivized by heavy penalties. What is the level of temptation to most human beings to commit this crime? Is it very tempting to commit this crime? The greater the temptation to commit the crime, the stiffer the penalty must be in order to deter him from his temptation. So, for example, when it comes to areas of sexuality, we all know, as our sages say, ein apotropos le'arayot, that it is virtually impossible when you seclude a man and a woman together to control what they're going to do. And as a result, if a person commits a sexual crime, the penalty must be higher than if, for example, he was going to commit another crime based on his weakness of fortitude, right? If a person, for example, eats a piece of bacon, the penalty will not be as strong as if a person commits a sexual crime, because people have a much stronger temptation for sexual deviancy than they do for eating non-kosher food. And we'll see that in a moment. And finally, the fourth consideration is the ease of the commission of the crime. How easy is it to commit the crime? The easier it is to commit the crime and get away with it, the more the Torah must instill fear within the perpetrator not to commit it, which of course is the example that we gave before. When you steal a sheep, you have to pay 4 times as much. When you steal an ox, you have to pay 5 times as much, because it's easier to steal an ox than it is to steal a sheep. Okay, so those are the 4 factors. Now, sometimes these factors will be consistent with each other. Sometimes the factors may conflict with each other. But once you have these 4 factors, the severity of the crime, the prevalence of the crime, the temptation involved in the crime, and the ease of the commission of the crime, then when you take one or more of those factors into consideration, the Rambam says you'll be able to better understand why the Torah doles out different levels of punishment for different perpetrators. With this introduction, we know that there are generally 4 levels of punishment. And the Rambam says, there's 4 like tiers of punishment. Now, there might be some fine tuning that's required, but that's the general rule. The highest level of punishment is the death penalty. The second level of penalty is what's called karet, which is for a major crime, which the sages convert to malkut when a crime is proactively committed, which means that if there is an action performed and a person is prescribed to get karet by the Torah, then the court will also arrest that person, give him lashes, and then release him. Now, what is karet? So it's very important to know that karet, as described by the Rambam, is as follows, and he writes this in Hilchot Tshuva. The Rambam speaks extensively about the reward of the world to come in the laws of Tshuva. He does so as well in his Mishnah commentary in his introduction to the 10th chapter of Sanhedrin. But for our purposes right now, we'll just provide an extract from the laws of Tshuva. And he talks about the greatest good that is waiting man is the non-physical pleasure of the world to come. And we've talked a little bit about it before, where the Rambam feels that the key to attaining the world to come is through that intellectual perfection that is the undercurrent of the entire guide. The Rambam writes that Kol mi she'eino zoche l'chayim elu, anyone who does not have the privilege of attaining the world to come, hu hamet she'eino chai la'olam. This is a person who, even though the Mishnah says Kol Yisrael yesh lahem chelek l'olam haba, all of Israel have a portion in the world to come, but there are certain people who lose that portion because they've committed a heinous crime. And what is that? What does that translate into when a person loses their world to come? Ela nichrat birisho ve'aved ki behema. Such a person is cut off from that eternal, non-physical reward, and he is lost like an animal. Just like when an animal dies, that's it for the animal. So too, there will be certain persons who do not have the privilege of the world to come, and they will die just like an animal. V'zehu karet haketuva b'Torah. And that is what karet is. Shenemar hi karet ti karet hanefesh that soul shall be cut off. Now, this is a much more extensive discussion. What is the definition of karet? But the simplest understanding for our purposes is that the highest level of penalty in this world is the death penalty. The second is karet, which is not visible within the individual because it's something that he only faces after he dies, or rather fails to face when he dies, but it's converted into malkut in our terrestrial realm. The third level is a minor crime for which the penalty is malkut, lashes, or a crime which entails what's called mita bidei shamayim, heavenly death, which is less than karet. It doesn't mean that you completely lose your existence in the next world. The Rambam doesn't carefully delineate it here. We're not going to get into it right now, but the punishment is malkut, to be administered. And the Rambam talks about these different types. In Hilchot Sanhedrin, the Rambam gives us a comprehensive list of which kinds of sins fall into this category. But an example of this would be to eat non-kosher food. And the fourth level is a negative commandment which does not even carry with it malkut. This level of prohibition is in the category of lav she'ein bo ma'aseh. If a person commits a crime of inaction, which means that he doesn't do something, and in the process of not doing something, he commits a crime, or if he commits a crime through words alone and not through any kind of physical act. Now, there are certain exceptions to this rule where a person will get lashes or worse, even if the crime that he commits involves no physical action. So here are the examples. One who swears in God's name in vain will get a much more severe punishment because it is necessary, the Torah says, to defend God's honor. And so there's capital punishment involved in that. If a person does an act of temura, where he had already designated animal A as his sacrifice, and then says, I've changed my mind, I'm going to switch over to animal B, the Torah places a penalty on that person, not the death penalty, but the Torah nonetheless places a penalty on that person. And the reason, even though there's been no physical act performed, but rather just a mental or verbal designation, that is in order to prevent someone from treating consecrated animals lightly. And another example is cursing another person in God's name, because in the masses' eyes, this is more offensive than personal injury, and therefore there will be greater penalty. A person will face lashes and the like, because he has used God's name to cause offense to another person. Now, it's quite curious that the Rambam writes, in the masses' eyes, this is more offensive than personal injury. It could be that in the Rambam's opinion, cursing someone is really meaningless as far as the impact that it has on another person, just in the same vein that when he talked about the performance of acts of sorcery and witchcraft, they really mean nothing because I cannot harm someone with words, but nonetheless, people perceive that to be a harmful and hurtful kind of pronouncement, and therefore the Torah needs to disincentivize it, because otherwise it will lead to very bad feelings within society and a certain level of breakdown within social interaction. Now, outside of these exceptions, a person cannot be penalized heavily for non-action crimes because A, or one, less harm is caused. Two, it is harder to avoid these crimes since their commission is in word alone and through passivity. Three, if people were to get malkut for these crimes, people would be flogged constantly. And four, it is also not practical to forewarn the individual in these non-action cases. So that's the reason why the fourth level or of punishment that the Rambam lists are commissions which involve no action and just either words or just complete passivity. There, a person will not get lashes. Now, regarding malkut, regarding lashes, there is wisdom involved in the Torah's prescription of 40 lashes for the perpetrator. And as we know, the Talmud says that it's not really 40, it's 39. So we're not going to get into a discussion as to why the Rambam says 40 and not 39. It could be that he's being consistent with what he said above. I'm here to explain the scriptural passages and not to get into the Torah Sheba'al Peh interpretation, the rabbinic interpretation. Now, the Rambam says that there's great wisdom. What is that wisdom? Not everyone gets the same amount, such that if a person is weak, the court will assess how many he is capable of receiving without sustaining permanent injury. Some people just, if a person's 80 years old and if we were to give him 40 lashes, he might get a heart attack or worse, then we downgrade the number of lashes. But there is an absolute amount, and that even the strongest of people never get more than 40. So the wisdom here is that yes, we need to make sure that the person who is the perpetrator understands the severity of the crime that he has committed. And therefore, the Torah prescribes 39 or 40 lashes to say that this is really what you deserve because you've done something that is offensive to God. You deserve 40 lashes. In reality, we will downgrade that amount if your physical constitution is not strong enough to endure that, because we don't want you to suffer more than what you deserve to suffer as a perpetrator of this particular crime. So therefore, we're going to make sure that you're not going to die as a result of the lashes, but what you deserve to get is 40 lashes. And the goal here is, once again, to disincentivize members of society from committing these crimes. Now, the penalties for forbidden eating, therefore, again, this is one of those examples of where there is no one harmed in society if I decide to eat chaz or treif, if I decide to eat non-kosher food or something that's forbidden. So the Rambam includes that here because it is still ben adam lechavero in the way that we will deal with that perpetrator. And the Rambam makes a point of saying that the death penalty is never administered for a person who eats something that is forbidden. Number one, because no great harm has been caused. And number two, people are not so strongly tempted by forbidden foods as they are in the case of sexual crimes, where sometimes the death penalty is administered. So again, applying the four factors of determining how severe the punishment will be, in the case of forbidden eating, there's no great harm. It's not a severe crime. It's not a heinous crime. And number two, the temptation is not as great. And so therefore, there's no reason to administer the full force of the death penalty. But for certain types of forbidden eating, karet is the appropriate punishment, and which is the second level of punishment, second only to the death penalty. Now, so why is that? So the Rambam explains that the Torah prohibits the consumption of an animal's blood because people desired its consumption due to its use in idolatrous cults, as explained in ancient idolatry texts. So, because there was a great temptation, because it was prevalent, the Torah needs to disincentivize it more, and therefore says that if you do it, you will get karet. Eating intestinal fats, also what's called chelev, also incurs karet. Number one, because there's a greater temptation. Apparently, people enjoy eating intestinal fat. I was not aware of this. If someone were to offer me intestinal fat, I would probably demur and decline the invitation. But apparently, in the ancient world, it was something considered to be very tasty. And number two, it is used in sacrificial service, and it therefore is more exalted in importance. Whenever, like we said before, regarding malchus, regarding a person getting lashes for passive crimes, sometimes when it comes to sacrificial things or areas of sanctity, if a person commits that crime, then he's subject to a stiffer penalty because the crime is more severe. And that's the reason. And the third type of thing for which is a forbidden form of eating, where a person is going to get karet for that forbidden eating, the Rambam provides us with two that are of the same category: chametz on Pesach and eating on Yom Kippur. Now, why are those two things considered to be deserving of karet, whereas if you eat from a pig, you only get lashes? Number one, it's harder to abstain from these foods, so the penalty must be stiffer because It is something that you normally eat the entire year round. So the Torah needs to remind you of the importance and to create a stronger deterrence. And number two, these abstinences engender fundamental beliefs. When the Torah tells you to abstain from chametz, it is to engender the necessary belief in the Exodus, which is a foundational belief that God took us out of Egypt. And therefore, by eating chametz, you in some way are suggesting that you don't believe in the Exodus, and therefore the penalty must be stiffer so that the belief in the Exodus will be further engendered within society. In the case of Yom Kippur, what is the fundamental belief? That there's a fundamental principle of teshuvah, of a repentance process that takes place on Yom Kippur. And therefore, if a person were to eat on Yom Kippur, that would unend that necessary belief within the individual and perhaps within society, and therefore it needs to be penalized more strictly. We're almost done. Certain sacrificial foods that are illicitly eaten earn the penalty of karet. And the Rambam goes through the list. Notar, pigul, a person who's tameh, who eats sacrificial food. We're not going to have time to go through all of these things today, but those kinds of forbidden eating of sacrificial items earn a person the stiffer penalty of karet. All these are punished in the same way that someone who ate forbidden fat is punished, in order to glorify the sacrifices, as we will explain when we get to chapter 45, and we go through the category of sacrificial offerings. Now, when we talk about the death penalties administered by the Beit Din are only administered when A, a necessary belief is corrupted, or B, a very severe crime has been committed. So some of the examples are, number one, we know for the three cardinal sins, idolatry, capital sexual crimes such as adultery and incest, and murder. Those are the three big ones. Those clearly we understand because of the severity of the crime, they warrant the death penalty. Now, another thing that warrants death penalty, which a person might not feel is so severe, is Sabbath violation. But why is the Torah so severe with the Sabbath violator? Because Sabbath observance, and this needs to be expanded upon in much greater depth at another time, observing Shabbat leads to the necessary belief in creation. We did have an extensive chapter in section 2 on the importance of the belief in creation and how this Shabbat engenders that belief. And if you recall from that chapter, the Rambam had said that the observance of the Sabbath engenders the belief, not the other way around. Number 3, the false prophet. A person who prophesies in the name of God falsely is going to be subject to great penalties because he's going to potentially lead people astray from the religion. Zakein Mamre is a person who is an elder who refuses to accept the majority ruling of the Sanhedrin. This will create great social unrest unless a great punishment is brought to bear on the person, thus deterring others from doing it. One who strikes or curses his father or mother is subject to the death penalty. And the Rambam says there are 2 reasons for this. Number 1, we don't like people who have chutzpah. To curse or strike a parent involves a great moral breakdown of character, and therefore the Torah wants to disincentivize that act of chutzpah within itself. And number 2, the foundation of every society, the very thing that forms the fabric of every social order, is the family unit. So by doing one of these acts of either striking or cursing a parent, one is deconstructing the very fabric of society. It certainly makes for good fodder for social commentary what's going on today. When you deconstruct the family, you deconstruct society as a whole. And therefore, the Torah needs to come down stiffly on anyone who tries to deconstruct society, because Hashem needs to maintain social order. 3 criminals are executed because of what they will do in the future. We talked a little bit about this in our previous chapter, where certain perpetrators can be killed. The Rodeh, for example, can be killed even when he's outside of Beit Din. But here the Rambam makes specific reference to 3 kinds of perpetrators who what they're currently doing does not warrant the death penalty, but we kill them, we execute them based on what we anticipate that they will do in the future. The most often quoted is the Ben Soreru Moreh, the wayward and rebellious child, who's just eating a lot and stealing from his parents. But we anticipate that if we allow this child to continue in his rebellious ways, he will end up killing people, and therefore, in order to prevent murder in the future, we are mandated to execute the wayward and rebellious child. A person who kidnaps. Now, this is something that's in the news right now, and it also is worthy of a pause. A person who kidnaps another is liable for the death penalty based on the presumption that when you kidnap another person and hold them for either ransom or for political reasons, you plan or are prepared to execute that person. So to prevent you from executing another person, we give you the death penalty, and this will disincentivize kidnapping within society. A bit of a social commentary on what's going on now. Hopefully, society will be disincentivized from kidnapping Israeli innocent civilians when they see what kind of vengeance is brought to bear on those who harbor kidnapped individuals. And this is just in the news. And thank God for the release of and for the regaining, not the release, but the retrieval of 4 of our kidnapped of our chatufim. Number 3, an intruder who breaks into a home with occupants present. The Torah says that if a person breaks into your home when you're present, you are allowed to use lethal force in order to stop them. In all 3 cases, these people are executed not because of their present activity, but because of what they intend to do, which is to shed blood. And only these great crimes are prescribed for the death penalty. And the Rambam wants to make a point of saying that the Torah limits itself in doling out the death penalty because God doesn't want to cause people to be executed. And as we know, and we'll learn about this in our next week's discussion of part 2 of chapter 41, it is very rare for the Sanhedrin to dole out the death penalty in general. And in contrast, not all sexual crimes receive the death penalty. And the Rambam wants to point out that the Torah is not as puritanical as we think. Only those acts which are either easily accessible, such as incest, most shameful, such as adultery, and C, have the strongest temptation, only those crimes does the Torah come down very hard and offer the death penalty. And again, it's not to punish per se, but rather to disincentivize these actions from being committed. All other sexual crimes, such as a sexual crime with a woman who was a nidah, who was menstruating, is karet, not the death penalty. Similarly, and with this we'll finish, not all acts of idolatry receive the death penalty, only the main ones, such as declaring the idolatry one's deity, prophesying in the name of idolatry, passing children through fire, ovid, oni, and other forms of sorcery that are identified in the Torah that are done for the sake of idolatry. Bottom line is that, at least where we're up to in this chapter, is that the Rambam underscores the fact that it's not always true that a person gets the death penalty, even though one would think that the Torah comes down very hard on perpetrators of general crime. That is the exception more than it is the rule. Unfortunately, my friends, we've gone way over time, and I do have to cut it short for today. We will be able to discuss some of these ideas a little bit more carefully, hopefully with next week's discussion. When we hopefully finish chapter 41, it's possible that we'll need a third week for chapter 41. We'll see how well we do. Let me wish you all a Chag Sameach and have a wonderful Shavuot. May we receive the Torah together. Am Yisrael Chai. Let's see a return of all of our hostages and a time of peace very, very soon. And I'm sorry that I won't have time to take questions today. It's just gone a little bit too over time. Wishing you all the best. Take care.
Amen. Amen. Thank you very much. Have a Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.